Hello, sisters. Lesbian Psychologies, Explorations and Challenges, edited by the Boston Lesbian Psychologies Collective. Part 2, Relationships. Essay number 9, The Effects of Women's Socialization on Lesbian Couples, by Sue Vargo. The past 15 years has produced a story of theory and research by authors including Carol Gilligan, Jessie Bernard, Cecilia Foxley, and others who, inasmuch as the writings present a departure from traditional psychological thought about women, can be called a quote-unquote new psychology of women. The strength of these new ideas is that they are based on research and thinking that assumes women to be different from men rather than defective men. However, their weakness from a lesbian point of view is that women and their contexts are largely assumed to be heterosexual. The purpose of this chapter is to see if some of these new ideas about female psychological functioning can explain dynamics of lesbian couples seen in treatment. Specifically, the literature suggests that socialization strongly affects the formation of female identity and shapes relational processes between women and others by influencing women to behave in certain ways. Dynamics between two women in an intimate relationship should be affected by the self image and relational patterns being influenced by socialization. Recent thinking about the socialization of women and its psychological implications rests on earlier research about sex role stereotypes. Well before the writings considered the new psychology of women, the Broverman's groundbreaking study of mental health workers' clinical judgments demonstrated the existence of gender identified standards of psychological functioning. This study showed that standards of mental health are influenced by stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. Behaviors judged psychologically healthy for men, competitiveness, assertiveness, aggressiveness, are judged psychologically unhealthy when observed in women. These male behaviors are also the standard for normal adult behavior. Thus, women are caught in a bind. Normal adult behavior is inappropriate because it is seen as male, whereas acting like women, being unassertive, interdependent, and concerned with others' well being, is by definition unhealthy. In short, women cannot see themselves as both female and healthy at the same time. Some of the new psychology's discussion of socialization builds on the double bind recognized in the Broverman study by adding the idea that women's socialization, not their intrinsic psychological makeup, is responsible for many behaviors associated with femaleness. If women behave independent, unassertive, and other oriented ways, it may be because they have been socialized to behave in the ways, and not because they are innately dependent, unassertive, and so forth. Combining this idea with the Broverman's findings about standards of mental health yields the notion that behavior previously thought to show both femaleness and psychological pathology may be learned behaviors that tell us nothing about femaleness or about psychological health in women. If previously held notions about women's psychological makeup were distorted by overlooking the process of socialization, how can we understand female psychology as it is affected by socialization? Carol Gilligan's study of women's moral development begins to identify female psychological processes that are a complex interplay of socialization and some real differences from men. Gilligan argues that women have different but equally healthy ways of performing basic psychological tasks. She suggests that women create a self image differently than do men, and that the difference in self image is then reflected in female interpersonal processes such as conflict resolution. Are these ideas about how women are socialized, how women's behavior has been judged psychologically and societally, and how all of that influences the creation of self image and relationship relevant to a lesbian couple dynamics, or are they heterosexist? To begin to answer that question, I will look at lesbian identity formation and the effects of socialization on lesbian couples through the new perspective described by using as examples couples from my clinical practice to explain the familiar lesbian couple dynamics. These couples were having difficulty resolving normal developmental issues that many lesbian couples resolve without the aid of couples therapy. Lesbian identity formation. reviewing what the literature says about women and socialization, one sees a picture emerge of women caught in a conflict between behaving in gender appropriate ways or being gender inappropriate in the interests of forming a positive self image. In general, women are taught to be dependent and passive, to seek attention and approval from others, and to attend to and respond to the needs of others. We are taught that to be other oriented, unassertive, and caretaking of others is to be appropriately female. We are also taught that self assertion and a priority of self over others are appropriately male, not female behaviors. Simultaneously, we experience the one down status of women in relation to men. We learn that female behavior and characteristics are less valued than their male counterparts, and that individuals who behave in female ways, whether they are male or female, behave in culturally devalued ways. The bind, then, is that to be gender appropriate, women must behave in ways identified with a one down status. Accepting that status makes the development of a positive self image difficult, if not impossible. Women have had a wide range of responses to this dilemma, all of which have profound consequences on sense of self. Some women accept the definition as one down and suffer from low self esteem and depression. Some attempt to define their position in society by glorifying traditionally female roles. Some women compete with men to be first class citizens, with varying degrees of success and mixed effects on their self esteem. Lesbians do not escape the major themes of female socialization, in that as women, we are trained to different degrees to be other oriented, dependent, and passive rather than self assertive. However, lesbians start at a different point in the process of resolving the conflict between being gender appropriate and having a positive self image. Lesbians are already being seriously gender inappropriate in their sexual preference for women. Their positive self image cannot come only from gender appropriateness. It has to involve a positive valuing of gender inappropriateness if they are to value their lesbianism. In the process of incorporating lesbians into self image, lesbians may suffer from gender confusion and isolation as they experience themselves as having quote unquote male traits, as being quote unquote exceptional women, and as being crazy, or at the very least, as being different from other women in some fundamental way. How individual lesbians resolve their self image in terms of seeing themselves as male or female varies immensely in terms of individual psychologies, norms of their immediate community, be it heterosexual or gay, and their socioeconomic situations. Lesbians living in feminist and well-supported gay communities may arrive at a more radical vision of self that includes a positive sense of choosing a blend of so-called male and female behaviors for self. Some of the literature on lesbian couples speaks directly to the issues created by lesbian struggles to value a gender inappropriate self in a larger context where women and homosexuality are both devalued. Dorothy Riddle and Barbara Sang write about the stress that lesbian couples experience from homophobia in the workplace. Fears about losing jobs or alienating colleagues because of their homosexuality often have to be dealt with within a lesbian couple's relationships. Negativity and doubt about the relationship are inspired by others' homophobia, compounding the internalized homophobia of the couple. Especially when couples lack lesbian support systems, the relationship becomes the only arena in which to resolve doubts and deal with others' disapproval. Riddle and Sang, and Laura Niemeyer as well, of a negative self image on intimate relationships. They feel that lesbians have to go through a process of rejecting society's stigmatization of homosexuality, both in terms of others' reactions to them and in terms of their own internalized negative judgments. Failure to work through to an acceptance of one's lesbianism is also the failure to achieve a positive self image. Riddle and Sang and Nehmeyer describe the effects of a negative self image on intimate relationships as including denial of feelings, denial of the meaning or existence of the relationships, and venting of internalized homophobia or misogyny at women partners. In one couple I saw in treatment, Nancy and Lynn, these dynamics were overt. Nancy repeatedly distanced herself in the relationship, seemed to have problems trusting Lynn, and alternately denied Lynn's positive feelings for her and devalued the relationship. Discussion revealed that although Nancy loved Lynn, she wished that Lynn was a man and eventually said, quote, "I love you, but I can't be a lesbian," end quote. Her internal image of lesbianism was so negative that she could not commit herself to Lynn, and she projected her negativity onto Lynn in the form of Lynn's suspected lack of commitment. Lynn's reassurance and promises of commitment or good behavior had no effect because Nancy was stuck in issues of self image. Until she could see her involvement with Lynn, and therefore her intimate and sexual self, in a positive way, the couple's dynamics could not change. Couples interventions aimed at the distance regulation mechanisms within the couple could not alter Lynn's and Nancy's roles as pursuer and distancer. Work on Lynn's and Nancy's relationship could not succeed until Nancy resolved her fears about identifying as a lesbian. A second couple's difficulties show the effects of negative self image and the destructiveness of homophobia on lesbian relationships that Riddle and Sang described. Liz complained that Carol wasn't affectionate enough, whereas Carol complained that Liz was overcritical of their relationship, which Liz hid from her colleagues at work. Sessions showed that Liz and Carol did not identify as lesbians and thought that coming out to straight friends or work associates would cost them jobs and friendships. As both women explored and let go of their negative attitudes toward lesbianism, identification as lesbians increased. They sought out other lesbians and began to come out to friends. Along with these changes came spontaneous displays of affection by Carol and a lessening of Liz's criticisms of their relationship. Changing their attitudes and behavior about being seen as lesbians brought an increase in feeling for each other and an affirmation of their relationship. As both women built positive lesbian images, ambivalence about their relationship lessened and conflict decreased. Socialization's effects on lesbian couples. Other researchers and theorists concerned with lesbian couples describe dynamics that relate to ways in which women are socialized. Joanne Creston and Claudia Bepko discussed the issue of fusion in lesbian relationships, defined as the blurring of boundaries between two women such that each identifies with the other's interests as much as with her own. In a fused couple, confusion ensues concerning which person is being threatened or helped by a given circumstance or action, and therefore which person has what kinds of feelings about the situation. Such confusion between two individuals has been seen as indicative of individual pathology, but the occurrence of fusion in a lesbian relationship may have to do with the socialization and identity building processes of both women have experienced. If being female has meant attending to others, maintaining a caretaking attitude towards others, and not asserting one's individual needs, as the new literature on women suggests, then two individuals following those rules together may well become involved in a circular process of orienting self toward the other. The two women in a relationship may consider their own and the other's interests in maintaining the relationship could well be the result of successful socialization and not indicative of any individual pathology. Therapeutic work on fusion issues with a lesbian couple will look very different if it is based on an understanding of these dynamics common to women, rather than a hypothesis of the individual's ego weakness or a hypothesis about communication patterns in the couple. Terry and Maggie came to couples therapy after 3 years of being together. For each, it was their first relationship with a woman. They had spent the great majority of their time together since they became involved and were now living together. They worked separately, but they knew and socialized with the same friends, knew each other's families, and were as involved as they could be in each other's work lives. When asked about the complaints that brought them to therapy, Terry tended to speak for Maggie and vice versa. It was often difficult to tell who was unhappy about a particular issue. Neither would admit to anger about anything, neither would make a demand on the other. Problems remained vague and relatively emotionless until we were able to unravel each of their concerns for the other person relative to each issue. It became clear that each woman had an elaborate mental construction of what the other person felt about a given issue and based their own position on trying to take the other person's interests into account. Terry knew that Maggie felt guilty about not visiting her mother as frequently as her mother wanted, and felt that Maggie wanted support for trying to stay away from her mother. In therapy, Terry presented Maggie's issues with her mother by talking about how much she supported Maggie's independence from her family. This presentation completely masked Terry's affection for Maggie's mother and her own wish to visit Maggie's family. Maggie, of course, received both messages about staying away from and about visiting her mother, and endless conflict ensued whenever plans to visit Maggie's family came up. Because Terry felt that Maggie disliked the visits because of Maggie's uncomfortable relationship with her mother, she tried to limit visits to Maggie's family. Neither of them communicated these constructions to each other, nor did they recognize that they seemed to be acting on each other's behalf rather than on their own. Both women came from large families with one parent in some way unavailable as a caretaker, and both had had a lot of practice in putting their siblings' interests first. Both had been punished for being assertive and rewarded for sensitivity to others' needs. Both found the process of asserting their needs within the relationship to be awkward, inappropriate, and to feel masculine. Practice at identifying their own interests and negotiating for them brought clarity to their relationship and allowed them to pursue their differing needs. The results were widespread, including the creation of time away from each other and the disappearance of some of the initial complaints upon entering therapy, such as being bored and unsexual with each other. Couples interventions that tried to increase their communication with each other did not succeed until their individual issues with revealing their own needs were resolved. This case also demonstrates the identity confusion described by Riddle and Sang. They see lesbians as experiencing identity confusion when they adopt quote unquote male traits, such as self assertion, in their work and personal lives. Other people's reactions to their violations of sex role stereotypes are stressful and make assertion harder because they are treated as being inappropriate. Terry and Maggie both found it unsettlingly quote unquote male to be more assertive with each other until they had experimented with assertiveness and found it to be productive, and accepted it as appropriate female behavior through modeling by their therapist and direct discussion of the issue. Socialization reworked. Letitia Ann Peplow and her colleagues did research about the attitudes of lesbians in coupled relationships towards quote unquote attachment and quote unquote autonomy, which were posed as two traditionally gender linked opposites. Quote unquote attachment, defined as needs for intimacy, dependence, and orientation toward others, was seen as opposing quote unquote autonomy, defined as independence, self assertion, and the drive for self actualization. The lesbians in the Paplo study did experience a conflict between needs for security and emotional closeness and needs for self actualization. But the research of Paplo and her group finds that lesbians see these two sets of behaviors not as mutually exclusive ends of a continuum, but as necessary parts of a balance to be maintained. Their research subjects struggles their research subjects struggle shows that lesbians in the study choose what will be called a more androgynous set of behaviors to meet their own needs for intimacy and autonomy. Paplo's subjects' preference for a balance of intimate and autonomous behavior suggests a different sense of the self. These women had a sense of an autonomous self within the assumption of relationship to others, rather than self that chose autonomy or intimacy. Accepting this perspective on self means a different assumption about the source of dysfunction in a lesbian couple. Issues around intimacy and autonomy might be resolved not by lessening one's personal attachment or the other's distance in the relationship, but by helping each individual to balance her needs for intimacy and autonomy. Given the socially created link between autonomy and maleness and intimacy and femaleness, individuals might be expected to be acting out in balance through gender linked areas of their lives together, and to experience a rebalancing of needs for intimacy and autonomy as involving ideas about maleness and femaleness. Sarah and Bonnie came to couples therapy complaining about conflicts that centered on Sarah's quote unquote overdependence on Bonnie. Bonnie's definition of the problem was, in fact, that Sarah was over involved in the relationship and depended on her for too much. Sarah's complaint, although it was less strongly asserted than Bonnie's, was that Bonnie was distant and rejecting. In talking about their relationship on a relatively mundane level, who went grocery shopping, cleaned the house, paid the bills, got the car fixed, we discovered that they had a breakdown of labor strikingly reminiscent of a traditionally heterosexual relationship. As they saw it, Bonnie did all the quote unquote masculine things, concerned with bills and cars and other mechanical things, while Sarah did all the quote unquote feminine things, concerned with creating a home, buying food, and taking care of health issues. Bonnie also advised Sarah on how to advance her career, while Sarah helped Bonnie understand her feelings. Both women openly appreciated the other's help, but there was also an agreement that what Bonnie knew about was more important than what Sarah knew about, an agreement consistent with society's valuing of quote unquote male abilities over quote unquote female abilities. Bonnie's rationality and pragmatic knowledge was seen as more useful and desirable than Sarah's emotional skills. They saw the problems between them as resulting from Sarah's dependence on Bonnie to help her deal with issues concerning jobs and finances, and as focused on Bonnie's resentment and Sarah's insecurity. Efforts by both of them to counter this imbalance tended to collapse when Bonnie became unhappy about something, at which point Sarah dropped her own agenda and helped Bonnie feel better. This couple had not reached the balance described in Paplos' research, where each partner pushed a balance between emotional closeness within the relationship and self actualization in the world. Sarah was responsible for closeness, and Bonnie for success in the world. When we began to discuss these responsibilities directly, both women shared resentments about being stuck in these roles, including feelings about being ascribed other gender appropriate and their problem as a couple as Bonnie needed to become more skillful in emotional areas, Sarah more skillful at managing in the world. Sarah also needed to be more assertive in the relationship, and Bonnie needed to take Sarah into account when making practical decisions that would affect them both. As they worked at these tasks, Bonnie's insecurity about her emotional capabilities became accessible, along with Sarah's already acknowledged fears about her practical ability. Blaming Sarah's quote unquote overdependence was replaced by valuing each woman's strengths and a lessening of gender appropriate stereotyping in their serious conversations and their humor. The female process of conflict resolution. The couple's literature and cases I have discussed so far relate to what the new literature says about women and socialization, including women's need to address the devaluation of quote unquote female traits and behaviors, essential female characteristics to include traditional. Gilligan's work on the moral development of women moves in another direction. Gilligan suggests that women have a sense of self, which, in contrast to male and traditional psychological models of self, is embedded in relation. Women's self-image comes in part from their relationships with others. Preservation of self and positive self image involves preservation of relationship. How women handle interpersonal conflicts thus involves a different set of psychological priorities than those involved for men. Gilligan feels that in contrast to the typically male mode of conflict resolution, which she describes as the application of moral principles to situations in order to produce right wrong judgments, women take into account the particular people involved in a situation. Women resolve conflicts by assessing the needs and vulnerabilities of the people involved in the conflicts and seeking the solution that involves the least damage to individuals and their relationships. A consequence of using the female model of conflict resolution is that the relationship between the individuals in conflict tends to be preserved because one or more of the members take responsibility for the effects of their actions and the other people involved on the other people involved. Choices to resolve conflict are made not just from the viewpoint of an individual woman's needs, but from her efforts to be responsive to others' needs as well. One result is that women's individual needs suffer whenever others involved in the conflict are perceived to be more vulnerable or more in need than self. Survey of lesbian couples provides a collection of portraits. Contained in the portraits are accounts of conflict resolutions around a frequently occurring issue for lesbians sexual monogamy. Mandola's couples all address the issue in some way, but each couple seems to have an idiosyncratic solution to the issue, ranging from sexual monogamy within the couple to a primary sexual relationship with other relationships acceptable to an asexual primary relationship. Applying Gilligan's model of women's conflict resolution to these couples, conflicts around sexuality reveals that their solutions follow a pattern. The couples involved seem to have made an assessment of their individual needs and ability to respond to those needs, and evolved a solution that respected both individuals' needs and maintained the relationship, just as Gilligan's model suggests they would do. Understanding how each couple's sexual agreements function is a lot easier if their conflict resolution process is examined, including their assessments of each other's needs and strengths. Many lesbian couples come to couples therapy complaining of an unsatisfactory sexual relationship. Practitioners may interpret lesbian sexual issues as problems of overattachment, overdependence, inability to express anger or tolerate conflict, in short, as failures of individual women to achieve sexual intimacy. If, however, practitioners accept a different view of what is healthy for women, a view that includes new thinking about the healthiness of relatedness and the positive self image maintained in relationship, we will make different assumptions about the causes of sexual dysfunction in lesbian couples. It may be true, as the following case illustrates, that sexual dysfunction results from a breakdown in a female process of conflict resolution rather than from individual pathology around sexuality. Kathy and Diane started couples therapy to improve their sexual relationship. At the beginning of their 3-year old relationship, they were sexually active with each other, but they had been having sex infrequently when they came into therapy. Diane also had had a series of affairs over the last year, all primarily sexual in nature and all tolerated by Kathy. Diane felt extremely guilty about the affairs and furious at Kathy for what she felt was a lack of interest in their sexual relationship. Kathy was hurt by Diane's affairs, but felt she could not object to them unless she was able to resolve her own sexual issues with Diane. Kathy thought it probably was her fault that she and Diane weren't being more sexual, but she had trouble being open with Diane since her affairs had begun. Diane blamed herself for getting involved with other women and driving Kathy away. At the beginning of therapy, both women clung to their ideas about their individual problems with sexuality. In reconstructing their sexual relationship from the beginning, however, we discover some things that contradict their apparent individual issues. Kathy had often been the initiator of sex between them, and Diane had felt pressure to respond. Diane had begun to feel inadequate and criticized by some of Kathy's feedback to her about their lovemaking. Diane got upset enough that Kathy began to back off, feeling that it was easier for her to do without sex than it was for Diane to deal with talking about it. Diane interpreted this as a confirmation of her failure as a lover and assumed that Kathy no longer wanted to be sexual with her. Kathy cooperated by assuring Diane that she didn't mind if Diane was too tired, too busy, or too tense to be sexual. Even though both women were still interested in being lovers, the frequency of their sexual interactions decreased as they each tried to be responsive to each other's needs. Kathy thought about Diane Kathy thought that Diane was more insecure about sex than she was, and therefore should be spared any pressure. Diane thought Kathy was overcritical because of her own insecurities about sex, and that Kathy should be spared having to deal with Diane unless she initiated it. This agreement eventually backfired when Diane started having affairs. Their beginning conflicts about sex, which had to do with Kathy's aggressiveness and Diane's insecurity, had become completely obscured by their conflict resolution process. Each tried to respect the other's feelings at the expense of their own. Once their assessments of the other's insecurities were shared and refuted, they were able to address the original conflict. Discussion at this point about their individual feelings about sex was useful and produced change, whereas attempts at changing their present day negotiations around sex in the beginning of couples' work had not been productive. Once their individual insecurities about sex with each other had been discussed, new negotiations about sexuality could begin, and the couples therapy could focus on building different communication patterns around Kathy's and Diane's feelings. Implications for lesbian couples. Lesbian couples, like those described, might have been misdiagnosed as having a variety of individual and relational problems that, until recently, have been associated with women: low self esteem, lack of sexual drive, depression, passivity, and fusion. The individual issues of the women involved can be better understood by examining the situation of women in a culture that prescribes various behaviors and, at the same time, labels them unhealthy. Ideas about female socialization and societal devaluing of women challenge conceptualizations of individual women as lacking normal adult abilities to be assertive or to value self. For many of the women in the couples described, the problem of creating a positive self-image while being appropriately female resulted in problems in achieving intimacy or self-actualization. The literature is heterosexist in stopping short of recognizing the additional complications of being lesbian in a culture that is also homophobic. Lesbians must come to terms with internalized and externally encountered homophobia in the process of creating a positive self image, as well as in figuring out a way out of the double bind that all women face, being female and seen as less healthy psychologically than men. There is much to be learned about how being lesbian affects the development of self esteem. Some of the research cited in this chapter suggests that lesbians construct self image differently from heterosexual women. It is possible that the interplay between lesbianism and building self esteem can make a positive self image either easier or more difficult to achieve. Where the literature is most helpful is in identifying women's socialization toward being primarily concerned with others' needs and how that influences processes like self image and interpersonal relating. Understanding the direction of socialization and its consequences gives us a context in which to predict normal individual development for heterosexual and lesbian women. Couples practitioners can then envision lesbian development as involving a struggle with learned female behavior concerning relatedness to others and self image. How women preserve a relationship while addressing their own needs, both in the service of maintaining positive self image, will affect lesbian relationships in different ways depending on the stages of individual development that each woman has mastered. Lesbian couples in trouble often have members stuck in a developmental stage unrecognized by themselves and unvalidated by an ignorant and unsupportive larger society. Therapeutic work with these couples must involve recognition of the normal developmental processes in, in lesbians of balancing needs of self and others and the effects on their relationships. Interventions aimed at individual pathology that does not exist or at couples dynamics that spring from individual crisis will not succeed. Clinicians must take care to assess how individual crises in lesbian development are affecting a couple and may need to sequence treatment to address individual issues before trying to change the couple's dynamics based on these issues. Practitioners also need more research into the issues of socialization, self esteem, and other relatedness that produce differences for lesbians. The new literature provides direction for those that research, particularly in terms of identifying uniquely female modes of functioning. It provides much needed frameworks to organize inquiry and thought. Theoreticians who think about lesbian couples should not dismiss the new literature as only about heterosexuals. Neither should they accept it without reflecting on lesbians and our place in society.